Hey everyone! So yeah, this is one of those dreaded compilation videos that you see all over YouTube now. What I've done is I've taken all of my Succession videos and I've compiled them and I've packaged them in one nice, neat, very long video for you to enjoy. And first of all, don't worry, there's new content coming. I know I stepped away from YouTube for a few months. I had personal stuff going on. And yeah, I had other things to attend to, but I'm back now. I'm working on videos again, so there should be actual new content coming in the next few weeks. Fingers crossed. So anyway, let's talk about what you can expect in this video. So essentially, this is a compilation of 6 of my previous Succession videos. It's a great thing to throw on and just go to sleep to, maybe. Just let me bore you to sleep here. The first 2 videos deal with the connections between Succession and John Berryman's poetry collection, The Dream Songs. As you may know, the season finale titles for each of Succession's 4 seasons come from the Dream Songs. So I dig into that a little bit, why that connection exists, and what it means. The second 2 videos are about Shakespearean themes and references within the Dream Songs. How does the Dream Songs connect to Shakespeare in some very, I hope, specific and enlightening ways? And then finally, the last 2 videos are just general reviews of specific episodes and scenes from the series. And so, yeah, that's all. Enjoy the video.
Who do you think I am? You think I want you dead? I'll be broken when you die.
There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart, so heavy. If he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, in all them time, Henry could not make good.
If you're so obsessed with Succession that the YouTube algorithm has fed you this incredibly obscure video by an even more obscure channel, then you're probably already aware of the fact that the titles of each of the season finale episodes so far have all come from the same poem. And that's Dream Song 29 from John Berryman's The Dream Songs. And if you're aware of this fact, then maybe you've been wondering, well, what the heck does Succession actually have to do with this collection of poetry? Is it simply that maybe the head writer or someone in the writer's room happens to love John Berryman, happens to love the Dream Songs? Is it just kind of an Easter egg for really obsessive viewers to pick up on? Or is there some connection between these poems and the series? I'm a huge fan of Succession, but I'm also a huge fan of the Dream Songs. It's one of my favorite collections of poetry, and I think a really underappreciated poetic work. It's significant enough that Berryman did win the Pulitzer Prize for the first collection that came to make up the Dream Songs, 77 Dream Songs, and ended up winning the National Book Award for the Dream Songs themselves. But since his death in the early 70s, the collection has kind of slipped into obscurity a little bit. It's still a staple of some college undergraduate level modern poetry courses and that kind of thing. But it doesn't have the kind of cultural cachet that some of Berryman's contemporaries, like, say, Sylvia Plath, still have. You don't see even, like, poetry nerds or whatever talking about the Dream Songs the way that you'll see them talk about, you know, The Wasteland or some other major poetic work that still gets a lot of publicity today and that still has its little, you could say, fandoms today. And I think that's a shame, but it also raises the question of how did this poem that's not super well known outside of academic circles, I suppose, end up with its fingerprints all over one of the more popular and critically acclaimed prestige series of today. It's a question that intrigued me, just because I'm such a big fan of the collection and such a big fan of Succession. So what I decided to do, just to satisfy my own curiosity more than anything, is to go back and really reread the Dream Songs with a thought to how they might connect to Succession. And my initial thought was, well, I'll pick out a few broad thematic connections between the two artistic works and maybe make one video where I try to tie them together. But what I quickly discovered was there are way more parallels than I expected. And if I just dive down that rabbit hole, I could end up with a video that's like an hour or more long, which would be, number one, just really impossibly cumbersome for me to record, given how little experience I have doing this, and my desire to do something kind of spontaneous and unscripted. And also, two, we'd end up with something that I wouldn't think would be very digestible for an audience. So what I decided to do instead is to record a bunch of shorter videos, with each video really focusing on a single connection that I found between the poems and the series. So I want to start with a big one. I want to start with what I think might be the most significant and obvious connection between the Dream Songs and Succession. And that's father figures. And more specifically, father figures whose influence you can't escape. Father figures who live as oppressive phantoms within the heads, within the psychology of their own children. So a little history here, and I'm going to have to be a little euphemistic about this because it touches on a subject that YouTube is notoriously cagey about. But John Berryman's father took his own life when Berryman was very young. So that's the kind of traumatic childhood event that you really don't get over. And as a result, the memory of Berryman's father and the memory of Berryman's father's death looms large over the entirety of the Dream Songs. There are multiple poems in this collection that directly reference Berryman's father and his passing. And there are other poems that refer kind of obliquely to them. And this includes actually Dream Song 29. And this is the poem, as I mentioned before, where the titles of the first, second, and third season finales come from. So the title of the fourth season finale has not been announced yet, but we can expect it's going to come from this poem too, if they follow routine, if they follow pattern. And maybe in a future video, if I manage to record one before the episode title is announced, I might speculate based on the poem on what some possible titles could be. But setting that aside for now, Dream Song 29 actually opens with a stanza that appears to be referencing the death of Berryman's father. And I'll read some of it really quick here. There sat down once a thing on Henry's heart so heavy, if he had 100 years and more, and weeping, sleepless, in all them time, Henry could not make good. So it's fair to assume that that thing that lay so heavy on Henry's heart, that lay so heavy on Berryman's heart, Henry being Berryman's kind of alter ego for the purpose of the poem. It's more complicated than that, but let's leave it at that for the sake of brevity.
My second wife and I once were walking down Hannaford Avenue in Minneapolis one evening in the direction of a bar. And we decided that the names that we disliked most were feminine, Mabel, and masculine, Henry. So, in an affectionate, sweet way, we began to, I would call her Mabel and she would call me Henry.
It's fair to say that this thing that weighs so heavily on his heart is his father's death. And in fact, as the collection goes on, Berryman makes it even more clear how completely and thoroughly damaged he is by the memory of his father. And the penultimate poem in the collection, Dream Song 384, is even more explicit. In fact, the entire thing plays out basically as this really graphic fantasy about Berryman digging up his father's grave and, to not put it too fine a point on it, desecrating his father's corpse. I'm just going to read it here. I'm going to read it in its entirety, and then we can talk about how some of this might tie into Succession. The marker slants, flowerless. Days almost done. I stand above my father's grave with rage. Often, often before, I've made this awful pilgrimage to one who cannot visit me, who tore his page out. I come back for more. I spit upon this dreadful banker's grave, who shot his heart out in a Florida dawn. Oh ho, alas, alas. When will indifference come? I moan and rave. I'd like to scrabble till I got right down, away down, under the grass, and axe the casket open, ha, to see just how he's taking it, which he sought so hard. We'll tear apart the moldering grave clothes, ha, and then Henry will heft the axe once more, his final card, and fell it on the start. So yeah, that's pretty unambiguous. And those are just 2 poems out of almost 400. And of course there are more. There are substantially more poems in this collection where Berryman is sort of in open combat with the ghost of his father. But in order to keep this video kind of brief, I'm not going to read and reference every one of them. Instead, now let's talk about Succession. I probably don't even need to say this, but Logan's influence over his children, Logan's oppressive influence over his children, is a massive recurring theme throughout Succession, if it's not the primary theme of the series. I mean, it's kind of right there in the title, isn't it? In fact, throughout the series, you see time and time again moments where each of the Roy children are trying to break out of Logan's grasp in one way or another, whether that's trying to directly defy him or beat him in a business deal or force him to retire and succeed him, or whether it's a little bit more subtle or indirect, like trying to break the psychological patterns that he's instilled in them, trying not to behave like him, or trying not to let the many nasty things he said about them,
Roman, you're a moron,
rule their behavior and have complete control over their mind and their approach to living. You see time and time again Kendall, Roman, and Shiv trying to escape their father's influence. And this is while he's still alive. And that is one difference between the Dream Songs and Succession, which is that a major reason why Berryman, or his alter ego Henry, can't ever fully reconcile himself to the impact that his father has had on him. The major reason why he can't obtain clarity or catharsis and break his father's grip over his life is that his father died in a way that ensured that Berryman would never be able to sit down with him and have a conversation and say, hey, this is how you screwed up my life. How can we make this good? Instead, he's haunted. In a literal and a figurative way, he's haunted. Whereas for most of Succession, the Roy children don't have that problem. They can sit down with Logan. They try to sit down with Logan and make it right on a few occasions. And something always gets in the way. Something always undermines that attempt. But, of course, now, spoiler alert, Logan is dead. And so for the remaining episode of the series, the Roy children are very much in the same position as Berryman's Henry is, as Berryman himself was, with a father who exists only as a ghost, only as a memory, only as a kind of psychological demon. And so I do wonder, moving forward, if that's going to be significant. If I'll look back at this video in a few weeks and say, oh, I can see even more clearly now the point of intersection between the dream songs and Succession. I do wonder, and this is a little bit of a tangent, it seems inevitable that we're going to see Logan's funeral. And given the rather graphic way Henry handles his grief in the poem, Berryman imagines handling his grief in the poem. If Logan's funeral isn't going to get ugly,
Complete disinheritance. Won't even speak at your memorial.
I kind of imagine, given the way Succession functions, that it's going to get ugly in a more subtle, interpersonal way with a lot of nasty dialogue and a lot of vicious back and forth between the characters. I kind of doubt that it's going to go full slapstick with, Logan's corpse being rolled out of his coffin and violated or whatever in some way, beat up or something. I kind of doubt that's going to happen, but I do think it's very interesting that the climax of the dream songs, the penultimate dream song, is this moment of just direct, violent confrontation between Berryman and his dead father. And the final arc of Succession has been about Logan's death and seems to be building up towards Logan's funeral. I do wonder if there's not going to be an emotionally similar climax, if not a literally similar climax between the two works. But that aside, even if we don't end up seeing Logan's funeral on screen, which seems really unlikely, it's unequivocal that thematically there's a real similarity between what's happening in the dream songs and what's happening in Succession. In that, dead or alive, these works are about fathers who have a massive, oppressive, commandeering impact and influence over their children, and are about the struggles of those children to reconcile themselves to their relationship with their father and to free themselves from their father's influence and their father's memory. And that, in and of itself, even if there were no other similarities or connections between the dream songs and Succession, would, I think, be enough to justify repeatedly referencing Dream Song 29 in episode titles. But, as I intimated at the top, I think there are plenty of more connections to be found here. And so I'm going to record some more videos. So if you found this somehow and you're watching this, stay tuned for that.
That could be it. The end.
The end? Come on.
There's something in my eyes.
Greg, hey, wasabi.
Is it wasabi? There's wasabi
it?
in my eyes? I've got wasabi in my eyes?
Wait.
Ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind.
Hey, so first of all, I want to apologize if I sound weird, or weirder than usual, maybe. That's because I have a cold. I'm getting over a cold anyway. In fact, as I speak, I'm trying not to sneeze. But the content of this video is kind of time sensitive, so I wanted to just record it and get it out before it's completely irrelevant. Anyway, let's talk about Succession. So, a couple of weeks ago, I recorded a video talking about some of the connections between Succession and John Berryman's poetry collection, The Dream Songs. Now, if you're not aware, the titles of every season finale of Succession so far have come from a single poem in this volume, Dream Song number 29. So in that video, I started to dig into the thematic connections that exist between Succession and the Dream Songs. And I promised that I would record more episodes digging into more connections between the series and the poetry collection. And I will do that, but this time around I want to drill in more specifically on the episode titles themselves and on Dream Song 29 itself, because the official title of the series finale was just announced, and sure enough, it's from Dream Song 29. So the aim of this video is going to be to answer a very simple but also highly speculative question, and that's, can Dream Song 29 tell us anything about what's going to happen in the series finale? And I think maybe it can. If not specific plot points, I think it can give us a little bit of a thematic clue about what's going to happen, and a little bit of a clue above and beyond what you might intuit from just hearing the title. And that title is With Open Eyes. So let's dig in here. First of all, let's talk about the previous season finale titles and how they tie into Dream Song 29. And this isn't just to fill space, because what I discovered as I went back and looked at these episode titles within their context in the poem is that actually the poem provides certainly insight, certainly additional context, but also maybe even spoilers for those episodes, depending on how you read it. So the title of the first season finale is Nobody Is Ever Missing, and that's actually the very final line of the poem. If you were to try to intuit what that line means, what Nobody Is Ever Missing means within the context of the episode without any knowledge of how it's framed within the poem itself, you might think that it's simply a kind of ironic or sarcastic statement about the state of the Roy family. Given that the episode is about Tom and Shiv's wedding, all the characters are gathered together in one location, and they don't all necessarily want to be there, and they don't all necessarily get along.
I think you need to go fuck yourself.
So you could see it simply as a sort of statement about the tense equilibrium in which this episode occurs, where there's this sort of pervasive underlying social discomfort between these characters, and yet nobody is missing. Everybody is forced to be there. Everyone's forced to occupy this space together. But if you look at it within the greater context of the poem, it might almost spoil the episode's ending. And let me show you what I mean. So I'm going to read that final stanza, the final stanza of Dream Song 29 that leads up to that line, Nobody Is Ever Missing. But never did Henry, as he thought he did, end anyone, and hacks her body up, and hide the pieces where they may be found. He knows, he went over everyone, and nobody's missing. Often he reckons, in the dawn, them up. Nobody is ever missing. So, within the context of the poem, this is a kind of anxious homicidal fantasy on the part of Henry. And Henry, if you didn't watch my previous video, or if you're not familiar with the Dream Songs, is the narrator of all of the poems in the series. He's a kind of proxy or stand-in for John Berryman himself. It's more complicated than that, but let's leave it at that for now.
Somebody quoted me as saying there's a fiendish resemblance between Henry and me.
And so what you have here is this paranoid fear on the part of Henry, the narrator, that at some point he might lose control of himself and murder someone, dismember the body, and hide it. So if you think about what happens at the end of Nobody Is Ever Missing between Kendall and the caterer who he accidentally kills and whose body he leaves at the bottom of a river or a lake. I forget what kind of body of water it was. You know, the kind of mini Chappaquiddick moment. And you compare that to the poem, there's a clear parallel there. And in fact, that parallel goes beyond simply accidentally killing someone or killing someone through a loss of self-control. Note that line, hide the pieces where they may be found. Now, quick aside, I was sure before they announced the actual title of the series finale that it was going to be Hide the Pieces, just because emotionally and thematically that felt so appropriate to the way that the Broken Roy children conduct themselves and deal with their lives. Like, there's this constant, perpetual effort on their part to hide their brokenness, to hide the pieces, to hide the shattered state that Logan has left them with. But I was wrong, so we won't dwell on that. Instead, let's go back to thinking about this in the terms of the first season finale, where the climax and ending of the episode are explicitly about Kendall trying to hide the fact that he's accidentally killed someone. But the poem doesn't just say hide the pieces. The poem says hide the pieces where they may be found, which is exactly what happens in the episode. Kendall is barely finished trying to cover his tracks when Logan reveals that he's entirely aware of everything that happened, and of course leverages it against Kendall to get him to drop his takeover bid. And also the deep irony of the use of that title within the episode, because of course someone is missing. The caterer is dead. He's gone. He's in a car at the bottom of a lake. So he's very much missing the next morning, which kind of speaks to something about the Roy family and the lives that they attach value to and don't attach value to. The idea that, nobody is missing, right? A nobody is missing. Somebody who is in their eyes is a nobody, whose life and death is inconsequential to them, except in Logan's case, maybe as a little bit of leverage, as another piece of capital to be exploited and to be used.
It's good to pay. The boy.
No, not that. On RPI, you're the best. Don't beat yourself up. No real person involved.
It's clear then what the connection is between nobody is ever missing within the context of the poem and the episode Nobody is Ever Missing. Now, I'm going to skip over the second season finale, This Is Not for Tears, for a really practical reason, and that's because the title of the third season finale, All the Bells Say, occurs almost directly before This Is Not for Tears within Dream Song 29. So, since All the Bells Say comes first, I feel like getting a grasp on how that works within the poem might help us launch into what This Is Not for Tears means. But also, there's a selfish reason for this too, which is I think that This Is Not for Tears is maybe a little more literal in its meaning, and maybe the poem tells us a little less about it. Anyway, All the Bells Say. This title, in and of itself, raises a question, which is, what the hell are the bells saying? It's a question not answered by the title in and of itself. There's maybe some implications you could draw if you just see that title in the context of the episode. Like, it does seem like an omen, right? If you're familiar with bells and the kind of like literary usage and significance of bells, usually if the bells are saying something, it's a kind of prophetic omen, or it's a kind of like underscoring of an importance of a thing. But that doesn't really tell us what the omen might be, or really tell us a huge amount. But of course the poem doesn't end there. We know what the bells say in the poem. To quote here, all the bells say, too late. And that's interesting, because this is another case where the poem kind of gives the game away. Because, of course, the final scene of the season 3 finale is Shiv, Kendall, and Roman arriving, thinking that they're finally about to gain the upper hand on Logan, thinking they finally have leverage over him instead of vice versa, and that they have the power to seize control of Waystar Royco and to block the impending merger, and discovering very quickly that Logan has outmaneuvered them again. And in fact, they're too late. They're too late maybe by minutes, since Logan has presumably just gotten off the phone with their mother, just finished negotiating the deal that screwed them. And so those two hidden words, those two words omitted from the title, tell us something about the episode, maybe spoil the episode a little bit. Maybe if you entered into that episode with what the bells are going to say in mind, you might have been a little bit deflated by the climax. You might have seen the climax coming. And also there's maybe a little additional implication that the central moment of the episode, which is that really unbelievably heartfelt and shockingly heartfelt reconciliation between Kendall and Shiv and Roman, might have also come too late. Certainly it came too late to allow them to seize control of the company or block the merger, but it might also have come too late to provide more than a kind of fleeting moment of catharsis for them, to allow them to fully reconcile and to move forward in a unified and emotionally healthy way. And certainly if the last episode that I've personally seen, America Decides, is any indication, that union between them was not bound to last. So that leaves us with the season 2 finale, This Is Not for Tears. Now, as I said, I'm a little shakier on this one, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, but I will read the line within the context of the poem, and we can see if we can puzzle something out here. So as I said, that comes immediately after All the Bells Say Too Late. So, all the bells say, too late, this is not for tears, thinking. And that's it. Immediately after that, we get the final stanza, which leads up to Nobody Is Ever Missing, which I already read. So what can we make of this? This is not for tears, semicolon, thinking. So that statement, this is not for tears, is maybe a little relevant to the final scene of the episode, to the choice that Kendall makes at the end of the season 2 finale. Because remember, instead of going forward with the plan to be the Waystar Royco sacrificial lamb for the Cruises debacle, Kendall instead decides to openly betray Logan and to try to use the controversy to maybe redeem himself a little bit, but certainly to finally put what he thinks will be the decisive knife in his father's back, although, of course, that turns out not so much to be the case. And Kendall, throughout season 3, proceeds to royally fuck himself, as he often does. But you can see how This Is Not for Tears might be reflective of the decision that Kendall makes. You know, rather than issuing a tearful apology, rather than taking on the guilt himself, rather than being emotionally open about his own crimes, by the way, he decides to go another path. And that path is a calculated one, a seemingly calculated one, is a conniving one. And so that might play into that one omitted word, thinking. The choice to think and plot and scheme rather than cry, rather than open up and accept the full emotional burden of your culpability. And that's where that semicolon comes in, because, and this is, and I apologize for getting really English majory on you here, But if that was "this is not for tears, comma, thinking," the implication would probably be, it'd be ambiguous, but the implication would probably be "this is not for tears are thinking," but the implication also being "but rather something else." But that semicolon indicates that thinking is a new thought, is a fresh thought. So it puts thinking at contrast with tears. It almost presents thinking as a choice made instead of tears, which would make sense within the context of the episode. Its meaning within the context of the poem, I think, is much more deeply ambiguous, and Berryman loves ambiguous phrasing that the reader has to interpret. But we're talking about Succession here. I'm sorry, John. I'm sorry, Berryman, for reducing one of the greatest works of modern English poetry to a, like, prestige TV theory crafting video. But anyway, that's what I can draw from This Is Not for Tears. So let's finally fucking talk about the series finale title, With Open Eyes. Let's start off by thinking about what conclusions you would draw from that title if you knew nothing about the poem. One thing you might say is, wow, that seems oddly uplifting for Succession. Given that when we think of With Open Eyes, it almost evokes this kind of romantic notion of moving forward without any falseness, without any pretension, without lying to yourself. And within the context of the Roy saga, you might think, oh, maybe the Roy children are finally going to come to terms with the impact that Logan had on them, are finally going to work out their interpersonal problems and move forward in a clear-headed, clear-sighted, maybe even unified, or at least emotionally healthy way. To which you might say once again, that doesn't sound like Succession. And indeed, if you look at it within the context of the poem, the implications are a lot darker. So let me read that stanza. And there's another thing he has in mind. Like a grave Sienese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. Ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind. Yeah, that's a lot bleaker. So let's take this bit by bit. So first, and there is another thing he has in mind. Like a grave Sienese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. So what's that another thing he has in mind? Well, as I said before, Berryman loves ambiguity. He loves to leave the reader guessing. But if you watch my last video, you might have a guess. And that's that Berryman is talking about the death of his father. And I don't want to go too deep into this. Go watch my previous video, which is all about the way the death of Berryman's father casts this long, dark shadow over the Dream Songs, and how that parallels the way that Logan, both alive and dead, has this tremendous oppressive influence on his children. But yeah, it's fair to say that the another thing he has in mind here is his dad. And then if you move on, like a grave Sienese face, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. So I could do a whole nother video about the grave Sienese face and what that is within the context of the Dream Songs. But TLDR, basically the grave Sienese face, it's a classical painting done in a very particular style that often included depictions of really stern, cold figures. And of course, Succession has its own stern, cold figure, and that's Logan Roy. And then if you move on, 1,000 years would fail to blur the still profiled reproach of. So what you have here is another thing Berryman loves to do, which is this kind of convoluted sentence structure. But what he's really describing here is this painting of this stern-faced, unhappy figure whose expression cannot be eroded by time, or has not been eroded by time. Since it's a painting, and since it's an old painting, there's no chance that the reproachful gaze of this figure is ever going to change. And within the context of Berryman's life and the Dream songs, that is potentially a reference to, once again, the oppressive memory of his father. This grave Sienese face could almost be another depiction of the ghost of Berryman's father kind of existing in his memory permanently in this kind of miserable state, looking down disapprovingly of his son. And what do you know? That sounds a lot like Logan Roy. And that also sounds a lot like where Logan is at now, existing only as this memory, as this ghost that the Roy children can't exorcise, at least not easily. But then there's the actual sentence where we find the title. Ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind. Now, first of all, ghastly, with open eyes, he attends, blind, just taken at face value, gives you a totally different impression than if you just saw the phrase, with open eyes. Instead of this kind of moment of clarity, this moment of clear-sighted vision, you get ghastly. You know, that you get an ugly, dark, bleak moment, and a moment of blindness, which is the very fucking opposite of what you think of when you hear the phrase, with open eyes. You think of vision, you think of clarity, but here it's with open eyes, blind. So what does that mean for the Roy children? Well, maybe it means the exact opposite of what I suggested before. Maybe it means that there's not going to be any clear reconciliation with Logan's memory, any moment of clarity of any kind, that instead maybe they will continue blindly to repeat these sick emotional and psychological habits that they're stuck in. But also, I've talked a lot in this video about Berryman's love of ambiguous phrasing, and we get that again here. Because who's the he in this sentence? The obvious intuitive answer is, oh, well, it's Henry, because the previous he's, for example, and there is another thing he has in mind, refer directly to Henry. But here, it's less clear, because we just saw the grave Sienese face, we just got the implication that we might be dealing with Henry's father here. So the he who's attending blind could be the father present at Berryman's side as a ghost, blind. You know, incapable of any kind of vision because he's dead. And that interpretation, in fact, is reinforced by the use of the word ghastly here, a word that you often associate with horror, and more specifically with ghosts and with the dead. So the image of someone ghastly being present but blind is very much this kind of spectral image, the image, once again, of the ghost that cannot be exorcised. And what do you know? Logan's presence in the series finale is likely to be exclusively that of a ghost, that of this spectral presence that the Roy children can't free themselves of. So anyway, I've talked this thing to death. I think this video is already going to be way longer than I expected it to be. I apologize for that. If you stuck with me, thank you. I hope this gave you some insight. I hope this provided you with something that you can glean, and I hope that maybe some of what's here might still have some critical or interpretive value after Succession ends. Because it'd be great if this video wasn't completely worthless a week and a half from now. Anyway, thank you. If you do by any chance like enjoy my thoughts on literature, on Succession, whatever, if you wouldn't mind liking or subscribing. I currently have 2 subscribers, so it wouldn't hurt. Anyway, either way, thank you so much. And yeah, I do intend to go back to talking about the thematic connections between Succession and the Dream Song, so expect that in a future video. Also, maybe, hopefully, expect some videos that have nothing to do with Succession or the Dream Song, and instead are maybe more film, television, or even literary criticism. Anyway, thanks guys, that's it. To hell with it, I'm done.
I can't do the thing. I actually can't do that anymore. I can't. I tried to sing it. I can't.
What can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak.
Nothing, my lord.
Nothing.
Nothing.
All right, so I want to talk about King Lear and Succession. And now I know there are already a number of YouTube videos on this topic, and I don't aim for this to be the definitive one. I'm not going to try to tease out all or even most of the parallels that exist between Shakespeare's play and the HBO series. In fact, I really want to focus this video on a single parallel, a single point of intersection or inspiration between the two. Because, let's face it, there are already a ton of videos out there exploring the ways in which King Lear inspired Succession and teasing out some of the connections that exist between the two works. And I'm reluctant also to do something really comprehensive because I think you could fall into the trap of treating Succession as if it were simply a contemporary adaptation of King Lear, which I don't think is what's going on at all. You see a lot of these like theory crafting videos that are attempting to draw really firm, clean parallels between characters in the play and events in the play and characters and events in the series. And I think, in fact, it's better to look at King Lear as simply one of the many inspirations, literary and otherwise, Shakespearean and otherwise, that the showrunners are pulling from. And I think approaching it in a more literal way is not only kind of silly and foolish, but also diminishes Succession as an independent work. Now, that said, let me diminish Succession as an independent work a little bit. So the scene I really want to focus on is the moment in Succession's penultimate episode, Church and State, when the 3 Roy children eulogize their father, Logan. And I think this scene actually has a very direct parallel in King Lear. In fact, I think it might be one of the most explicit parallels to the play that I've seen in the series so far. Outside of, the obvious fact that it deals with a kind of aging monarch and his 3 children. So you might say, I don't remember King Lear having a scene where his children eulogize him. And of course there is no scene like that in the play because all 3 of Lear's children predecease him. They die before him at the end of the play. I guess spoiler alert for one of the most famous works of drama of all time. But yeah, Regan, Goneril, and Cordelia don't make it out of the play alive. And neither, of course, does Lear, but they die before he does. However, I think there is a clear connection between this scene and King Lear. It's just that the moment in King Lear that's being referenced here, or that the scene may be drawing inspiration from, actually comes very early in the play. In fact, it's at the very beginning of the play. And that's the moment when Lear is making the decision about how he's going to divide up his kingdom among his 3 heirs, his 3 daughters, and he does a remarkably narcissistic thing. He goes to each of his 3 daughters,
Cordelia, Regan, and Goneril in turn and asks them to tell him how much they love him, how much he means to them. And what happens is Lear's eldest daughter and middle daughter, Cordelia and Regan, both shower praise upon their father. They talk about how they love him more than anyone else in the world. Here, I'll actually read just a little bit here. His first daughter, Goneril, says, "Sir, I love you more than words can wield the matter, dearer than eyesight, space, and liberty, beyond what can be valued, rich or rare, no less than life, no less than life." So she's saying she loves her father more than she loves life itself. And then his second daughter, Regan, makes a conscious attempt at one-upsmanship. In fact, let me read a little bit of what she says. "Only she comes too short," she's talking about her sister here, "only she comes too short, that I profess myself an enemy to all other joys, which the most precious square of sense possesses, and I find I am alone felicitate in your dear highness's love." So what she's saying in a more contemporary way is, actually, I love you even more than Goneril. I love you even more than my daughter, which is kind of the second mover's advantage. She could just say, "Oh yeah, my sister said she loves you, but I love you even more." And in fact, she says she loves him even more than any other joy. There's nothing in the world that brings her more joy than her father, which is a truly touching sentiment if you know nothing about how the rest of the play goes. So then Lear moves on to his third and youngest daughter, Cordelia, and she refuses to flatter him. It's not that she doesn't claim to love him. It's that she refuses to shower him with this exuberant, falsely excessive praise. And I'm going to read just a little bit of that here. So Lear says, "What can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak." And Cordelia says, "Nothing, my lord." Lear says, "Nothing?" Cordelia says, "Nothing." Lear says, "Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again." Cordelia says, "Unhappy that I am, I cannot heave my heart into my mouth. I love your majesty, according to my bond, nor more nor less." So what Cordelia is saying here when she says she cannot heave her heart into her mouth is basically that language is ill-equipped to express emotion, to express profound emotion. In some ways, she's saying that old cliche, which is, there are no words to express my love. But she's not saying it in the way that cliche is usually meant. She's not saying, there's absolutely no way language can express how much I love you. Instead, what she's saying is, the contents of my heart cannot be translated into language in a pure and honest way, which is an incredibly lucid and modern thought. But she's also taking, in this moment, a very clear and principled stand against empty flattery. She's saying that love cannot be expressed merely, purely, or correctly, or truly, honestly, through words. Which, as the play goes on, turns out to be incredibly true. Goneril and Regan do not have their father's best interests at heart and end up betraying him over the course of the play, while Cordelia remains loyal. It's a little more complicated than that, and honestly, Goneril and Regan have their reasons for turning against their father. He's honestly kind of a dick throughout the play. I mean, basically he garrisons his soldiers, his knights, at their estates, and goes on to throw a bunch of loud, lavish parties that his daughters don't really appreciate. And also, he's coming mentally undone over the course of the play. So he's the kind of father who might get on anyone's nerves eventually, just as Logan does. But that's a complete aside. The main point is, there's this moment where all three daughters are asked to flatter their father. Two of them do, and one of them refuses. And what's the end result of that in the play? Well, Cordelia is disinherited by Lear. She loses any claim to any part of his kingdom, and she's cast out into exile, basically, in France. And here's where the parallels with Succession come in. Here's where we can see some really explicit connections to what happens in Season 4, Episode 9, Church and State. And specifically to the 3 eulogies that the Roy children give for their father. Because think about those 3 eulogies. You have 2 eulogies, the eulogy by Kendall and the eulogy by Shiv, that are basically making an explicit attempt to flatter Logan, or at least to present his legacy in the most positive possible light. And just like in the play, there are ulterior motives at work here. Shiv and Roman are not acting in a selfless way out of love for Logan. They know that they're in front of an audience. And in fact, just like Goneril and Regan are entirely aware that their words are going to determine what share of their father's kingdom, what share of their father's inheritance they get, Shiv and Kendall are very much aware of the audience that they're in front of how their words could determine the future of Waystar Royco and could impact the different plays that they're both making to be seen as their father's heir, to be seen as their father's successor. At this point, both Kendall and Shiv are very much playing for the CEO position. Shiv wants to convince Madsen to make her CEO if the acquisition goes through. Kendall is trying to block the acquisition so that he can remain CEO. And so their eulogies are actually a kind of audition, a kind of job interview, and are very much focused towards trying to secure a material outcome, secure their piece or the entirety of their father's estate, just as is the case with Goneril and Regan.
Of buildings he made stand, of ships, steel hulls, amusements, newspapers, shows, and films, and life, bloody, complicated life. He made life happen.
You did okay, Dad. We're all here, and we're doing okay. We're doing okay. So, goodbye, my dear, dear world of a father.
And in the cases of both King Lear and Succession, there's a third child who doesn't flatter their father. There's a third child who says nothing. You know, in the case of the play, Cordelia explicitly uses the word nothing, and Roman finds that he's incapable of saying anything. He gets to the podium to eulogize his father, and words completely fail him. He just breaks down. And there's that moment where his voice falters, which is so rare for Roman. Roman, who always seems to have something to say, who always seems to be talking, even when he shouldn't be, even when the thing he's saying is inappropriate, and who is always so ironic and detached and unemotional. For him to have this moment of real, sincere emotion and for it to leave him speechless is incredible. And of course, just as Cordelia is speechless, just as Cordelia says nothing out of true love for her father, out of an unwillingness to lie to her father, out of an incapacity of words to express what she really feels, so too does Roman find himself speechless because he actually loved Logan. It's a moment of unbelievable, honest love for his father and on his grief at the loss of his father. When he, after he's left the podium and he turns to his siblings and looks at the casket and says, "Is he really in there? My God."
Is he in there?
Yeah.
Can we get him out?
Is there a more sincere expression of grief than that? And it really underscores the degree to which, for everyone else up to this point, Logan's death has been, to some degree, a play. And I don't want to get at the ironic Hamlet play within a play thing here, but there has been so much calculation and there has been so much consideration paid up to this point for appearances and how these characters are supposed to grieve and how their approach to their father's death will impact their future within the company, that there really hasn't been, outside of the immediate aftermath of Logan's death in the Connor's wedding episode, there really hasn't been a moment of actual, direct, sincere grief. And we finally get that from Roman in this episode. And instead of coming in the form of a touching eulogy for his father, it comes in the form of an inability to speak, an inability to express himself, in the form of a kind of nothing, just as Cordelia says nothing. And, interestingly, it seems like the consequences for Roman will be very similar to the consequences that Cordelia faced in the play. By the end of the episode, it seems as if Roman has been disinherited in a way. Certainly, he's in an inauspicious position compared to his two siblings. At the end of the episode, it seems as if Madsen and Shiv have been successful in striking a deal to prevent the merger from being blocked. And we also see that Kendall has engaged in some politicking of his own during the funeral and is preparing to launch an offensive to try to block the acquisition at the shareholders meeting. Whereas Roman is in a much less advantageous position. In fact, as Kendall tells him near the end of the episode, "You fucked it."
I don't really feel so great.
Yeah, I know.
Sorry.
That's because you fucked it.
The implication, I think, being that his show of emotion at the funeral, his show of vulnerability, especially at the funeral, may have made him appear weak to the shareholders, to the staff, to the incoming president. At the end of the episode, there's no question that Roman is in an incredibly bad position, not only in terms of his political power within the company, but also just personally, he's clearly having a breakdown. If you look at the sequence at the end where he essentially goads protesters into beating him up.
Fuck you! I'm full of shit! Get the fuck out of here!
And in fact, that final scene is of him kind of wandering off into exile, not to strain the comparisons with the play too much and the comparisons between him and Cordelia too much. But that final sequence is Roman wandering away from the funeral and from his family and into the mob, into the wilderness, just as Cordelia is disinherited and sort of cast out to France. Now, Cordelia marries the king of France, and and so she's not exactly living rough. But there's also another character, interestingly, in King Lear, Edgar, who is another legitimate heir who is usurped and who very much is cast out into the wilderness. He basically ends up living as a half-mad beggar for a good portion of the play. But that's a little bit too much of an aside here. And I hope I've made clear the seeming inspiration that Succession is drawing from the opening moments of King Lear in this sequence where you see the three children eulogize Logan. But there's also just a little bit of subversion here, because, of course, this moment doesn't come at the beginning of the series. It isn't positioned where it is in King Lear. It comes at the end of the series, or practically the end of the series. And I think that's something that Succession likes to do, which is it likes to reference Shakespeare, but it also likes to subvert your expectations for how it's going to reference Shakespeare. You won't see very many just direct, clean, clear parallels where it's like, oh yeah, this is an adaptation of that moment from the play. Instead, you see these reversals, and in this case, you see the series flipping the play on its head in, I think, kind of a cool way. And just one final aside before I close out, there's another subversion, I think, of Shakespearean expectations going on here. And that, I think, comes in the way that the series goads the audience into expecting a very different Shakespearean Roman eulogy. And that's not a eulogy given by the character Roman, but a eulogy that begins friends, Romans, countrymen. And that's, of course, Mark Antony's eulogy for Caesar from Julius Caesar. And that eulogy is not only one of the most famous speeches in all of Shakespeare, but it's also very much the kind of speech you would expect from Succession, which is to say that it's a very calculated political speech and a deeply backhanded speech. I'm not going to read it here, but in the speech, under the pretense of eulogizing Caesar, Mark Antony is really revving the Roman populace up to prepare for revolution, to get ready to revenge Caesar, and maybe, possibly, to back Antony himself in his impending war against Caesar's assassins. And it's funny, because we almost get a eulogy very much like that. And that's the eulogy that you see Roman practicing at the beginning of the episode. And the funny thing is, that eulogy is almost a kind of Shakespearean monologue or soliloquy, because it's a rare moment in Succession where you have a character talking to themselves. In the same way, in a Shakespearean soliloquy, a character will address the audience directly and give a peek into their thoughts. Here you have Roman practicing the eulogy, talking only to himself, and by extension, sort of talking only to the audience. And that speech, the speech that he never actually ends up giving, is very much a calculated one, is very much one intended to ingratiate himself to the audience at the funeral, is very much the speech his siblings are expecting him to give, and is very much the kind of manipulative piece of rhetoric that Mark Antony gives in his eulogy of Caesar.
I am King Dong. I am the King of Dong. Bow down to me.
So since I think a lot of viewers are aware that Succession draws from literary influences, and especially draws from Shakespearean influences, I don't think it's totally accidental that we get this moment at the beginning that evokes a different Shakespearean eulogy and leads us to expect one kind of allusion to Shakespeare. And instead, the episode ends up delivering us another in the form of these three eulogies that feel really similar, I think, in tone and in theme, if nothing else, to the opening of King Lear. All right, that's it. That's it. I talked for longer than I planned to. Thank you for watching. If you did enjoy this, I gotta say it. You know I gotta say it. Please like and subscribe. I'm up to 11 subscribers, so, you know, maybe this video will get me up to 12. Who knows? Anyway, thank you so much. I appreciate it. That's it. I'm done.
What?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
The scorpion.
Mm.
Because
full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife.
Okay, I know I said at the end of my last video that my next video would be about something other than Succession, but I was digging through the comments for one of my previous videos, and I came upon one that really got inside my head, and now I have to make a video about it. And the comment in question was from Matthew Flock, or Matthew Flack, or something like that. Matthew, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name, and I'm sure I am. But Matthew asked me to take a look at Tom and Shiv's relationship through the lens of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Now, I'll be honest, when I initially saw this comment, I had some trepidation about doing a video on this topic. And the reason for my hesitation is that once you're aware that Succession's writers were heavily inspired by Shakespeare, it can be very easy to go and search for every episode looking for connections that are maybe really loose or maybe spurious or questionable. There will be a real temptation to look at every one of Shakespeare's plays and all of his characters, and especially his most famous characters, and say, oh, well, this character is obviously inspired by this character from Shakespeare, or this scene is straight out of Shakespeare. And once you start doing that, you can end up with some pretty loose and speculative connections. Some connections that, sure, they make sense if you squint, or they make sense from 1,000 yards away, but maybe they don't tell us anything interesting or insightful about the series. Maybe they don't help us better understand either Succession or Shakespeare. And so I was a little worried because I knew there'd be real intellectual temptation to say, oh yeah, Tom and Shiv are Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. Because, hey, look at it. You have two characters, they're married to each other, they're always plotting and scheming, they're deeply ambitious, they're plotting to claim the throne. You know, it's so easy. It's so easy. And I don't want this to be easy in the wrong way. But nonetheless, it got in my head. The idea got in my head. There were enough parallels there that I was like, well, maybe there's something here. And then while I was reading through the play, I stumbled on a line that made me stop and think. Because it not only made the connection between Tom and Shiv and Macbeth and Lady Macbeth feel a little more intentional, but it also brought to mind a certain moment from the series that had been stuck in my head that I was trying to make sense of. The line that caught my attention is early in Act 3, about midway through the play. And just to give a little context, this is well after Macbeth has murdered King Duncan and claimed the throne for himself. And Macbeth is in the midst of this paranoid tirade where he's basically racked with guilt and certain he's going to be found out, certain that he's going to lose his title and his life. And he just blows the hell up and goes on this tirade, this really self-loathing monologue that's occasionally interrupted by Lady Macbeth essentially telling him, hey, buddy, calm down, get your shit together. You can't be seen acting like this.
Treason's done his worst. Nor steel, nor poison, malice domestic, foreign leather. Nothing can touch him further.
Come on.
And in the middle of this tirade, Macbeth says this: oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife. And I thought, hey, I've seen a scorpion somewhere before. And of course, I'm referring to the scorpion paperweight that Tom gives Shiv at the beginning of the episode Tailgate Party.
Because it's funny.
And now you might say, wait, hold on, buddy. I thought you just said you wanted to avoid reaching for these kind of strained comparisons between Shakespeare and Succession. And here you've plucked one line out of Shakespeare and you're trying to compare it to a single scene in the series. And to that I say, yes, but I do think that maybe the writers had this moment in mind when they wrote that scene. And there are a few things that make me think that. First of all, let's look at what the Scorpions are in Macbeth and compare them to the meaning of the Scorpion paperweight in Succession. So what is Macbeth really saying when he says, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife"? Well, let's back up a little bit and read what happens immediately before that. So as I said, Macbeth is in the middle of this paranoid tirade. He's sure he's going to be found out. He's sure his enemies are going to fall upon him at any minute. And he says this: "Unsafe the while that we must lave our honors in these flattering streams, and make our faces vizards to our hearts, disguising what they are." And then Lady Macbeth says, "You must leave this." Or in other words, "You gotta let this go, buddy." And that's when Macbeth says, "Oh, full of scorpions is my mind, dear wife, that thou knowest that Banquo and his fleance lives." Banquo is the friend and fellow lord of Macbeth's, who also bears witness to the witch's prophecy, where they essentially tell Macbeth that he's going to be king. And also they tell Banquo that he won't be king, but that he will father a line of kings. So Macbeth is really paranoid about Banquo for a couple of reasons. First of all, Banquo starts to get pretty fucking suspicious. He's just seen the witches tell Macbeth, "Buddy, you're going to be king someday." And then the king turns up dead in a position where Macbeth had every opportunity to murder him. So Macbeth has some inclination that Banquo is suspicious. And also Macbeth is really troubled by the part of the prophecy that says that Banquo's heirs will be king. Because that's a pretty direct threat to Macbeth's own rule.
Our fears in Banquo stick deep.
And so Macbeth basically sends murderers out to kill Banquo and to kill his son, Fleance. And they do succeed at killing Banquo, but they don't kill Fleance. But at this moment in the play, Macbeth doesn't know the outcome of his little planned assassination attempt. And so he's raving, and he's suspicious, and he's paranoid.
"Better be with the dead, whom we to gain our peace have sent to peace, than on the torture of the mind to lie in restless ecstasy."
And so within that context, the scorpions that have invaded his mind are these paranoid, intrusive thoughts that won't let him rest, that are constantly stinging him, that are constantly waiting underfoot to poison him. But the scorpions aren't simply fearful thoughts. They're not simply anxieties that he has about losing his position. They're also unequivocally feelings of guilt. And let me back up a little bit and tell you why I think that. Remember, he says that we must lave our honors in these flattering streams and make our faces vizards to our hearts, disguising what they are.
"Unsafe the while that we must lave our honors in these flattering streams and make our faces vizards to our hearts, disguising what they are."
You must leave this!
And what he's saying there is basically, I'm tired of hiding who I am. Remember that a vizard is basically a disguise, and you can tell that even if you don't know that word, you can actually discern it through context clues, because disguising occurs in the next line. So he's talking about being exhausted by having to constantly disguise who he actually is. And also remember the streams of flattery before. He's tired of constantly having to engage in flattery, in constantly having to say these kind, gentle, uplifting words to other people when he knows his heart is full of murder, when he knows the evil deeds that he's committed, and when he knows things are fundamentally not right. So he's tired of lies, and he's tired of deceit. And boy, what relationship in Succession does that sound a lot like? What relationship in the series is characterized by guilt, deception, flattery, a constant need to disguise who you actually are when dealing with the other person. What relationship is characterized by constant fear and paranoia and distrust? Tom and Shiv's, right? And not only that, but this very episode, Tailgate Party, ends with a confrontation between Tom and Shiv, where Tom and Shiv both drop their psychological and interpersonal disguises, the disguises that they've been using to deceive each other about the nature of the relationship, and the disguises that they've been using to deceive themselves about the nature of their relationship. And they really just fucking have it out.
My dad was dying. What was I supposed to say?
Perhaps no?
And the Scorpion, within Succession, and I'm not even talking about Macbeth now, but within Succession itself, the Scorpion kind of serves as the first instigating event that leads to that moment of confrontation between them. And in fact, the Scorpion comes up during that fight.
Should we have a real conversation?
With a scorpion?
That was
No.
a friendly thing.
Oh,
That was
yeah,
a friendly
sure.
thing.
You're real friendly.
And the fact that Shiv felt so deeply insulted by being compared to the Scorpion comes up during that fight as well. And that's interesting as well, I think, because I do think that you can read the play to suggest that Macbeth is also talking about Lady Macbeth when he mentions that his mind is full of scorpions. Not only because he immediately refers to her in that line, right? He ends that line with "my dear," referring to Lady Macbeth. Not only because the line arrives in the midst of a conversation between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, but also because within the play, Lady Macbeth serves a very Scorpion-like role in that she's always kind of hanging back to sting Macbeth, to prod Macbeth, to push him forward whenever he gets a little guilty, whenever he starts to question the ethics of his behavior, whenever he starts to feel guilty or think he should stop. She's always there pushing him forward.
Wouldst thou have that which thou esteems the ornament of life, and live a coward in thine own esteem, letting I dare not wait upon I would?
She's very much like the Scorpion at his heels, waiting to sting him if he ever stops, if he ever rests, if he ever tries to change course. She's very much constantly inside Macbeth's head to a degree, just like the Scorpion, trying to dictate his actions, cajoling him, and trying her best to persuade him.
But screw your courage to the sticking place, and we'll not fail.
And this actually brings me to what Tom says when Shiv tries to get him to explain the Scorpion gift. Obviously, at first he says, "Oh, honey, it's just a joke." And he tries to play it off. He doesn't want to explain it. On some level, because he understands that it's fundamentally an insulting thing that can't possibly be explained in a totally benign way. It's not truly an affectionate, lovey-dovey gift as much as he wants to spin it as such. But when he finally breaks down, first of all, he admits that he sees Shiv as the Scorpion. But then he says, "I love you, but you kill me and I kill you."
I love you, but you kill me and I kill you.
And boy, that sounds a lot like the relationship between Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, in that they quite literally end up killing each other. Although Macbeth doesn't murder Lady Macbeth directly, and Lady Macbeth doesn't murder her husband, there's no question that they both end up dead at the end of the play as a direct result of their toxic, pathological relationship. Macbeth would never have murdered the king and seized the throne if Lady Macbeth hadn't been in his ear, pushing him to fulfill the prophecy by any means necessary. And he wouldn't have committed many of the other murders and crimes he commits over the course of the play if she wasn't always behind him, egging him on. And so as a result, Macbeth would never end up dying in battle at the end of the play if he hadn't taken the actions that Lady Macbeth pushed him to take. But also, Lady Macbeth's death by her own hands is not purely her own fault. She dies because she is overcome with guilt, but she's not overcome with guilt over actions that she personally took. She's overcome with guilt over the actions that Macbeth took, over the murders that he committed, over the crimes that he committed. So if he hadn't listened to her, if he had brushed her aside and said, "No, I don't feel like killing the king tonight, honey," then there would ultimately have been nothing for her to feel guilty about. There would have been no reason for her to be fatally consumed by guilt and regret. So it's fundamentally similar to the toxicity that exists between Tom and Shiv, that Tom so efficiently and eloquently highlights when he says, "You kill me and I kill you." And of course, Tom and Shiv don't end up killing each other. In fact, Tom makes out pretty good at the end of the play. But you see this phenomenon often in Succession, where there will be these sort of verbal homicides. Characters will say that they're going to kill someone or something, or brag about having killed someone or something, without actually having committed any truly violent act.
Unless we kill him.
Okay. Kill him.
Yeah.
I like that. That's intriguing.
What's Bill doing here?
Oh no, Jerry, if we're gonna kill Bill, I don't want to see Bill.
And I kind of think on the writer's part, all of those moments where you have these kind of verbal declarations of violence, but no actual violence, allow them to include a lot of the violence that exists in Shakespeare and adapt it for a setting and for a world that, unlike medieval and pre-medieval Europe, is not full of people actually slaying and beheading each other to gain power and to gain authority. It allows the writers to recreate that sense of this violent, chaotic struggle for power and nobility, while still grounding it within the reality of our contemporary world.
We can find a cool structure, right? Like fiefdoms, kingdoms.
So that Succession doesn't become one of these quote-unquote prestige series that are really nothing more than a string of characters killing each other and a string of deeply implausible deaths, which is really something that I admire about the show, is its restraint and its unwillingness for the most part to use death as a way to get an easy emotional rise out of the viewer. So, yeah, Tom and Shiv don't kill each other, but they're constantly killing each other. They're constantly killing each other psychologically, verbally, through interpersonal ugliness, through deception, and through their vicious selfishness.
I'm sorry, but you have hurt me more than you can possibly imagine.
There's also one more quick little parallel between this moment in Shakespeare and that episode in Succession. As I said, this scene occurs early in the play's third act, and it actually occurs just before Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are going to hold this huge banquet. And that's the very banquet that the ghost of Banquo shows up at after he's been murdered at Macbeth's orders, and sits down in Macbeth's seat at the table at the banquet. And only Macbeth can see him. And Macbeth has this violent, guilt-ridden meltdown where he's screaming in front of his guests at this ghost that only he can see, or that maybe only he and Lady Macbeth can see. It's a little ambiguous in the play whether she can see it too, just as maybe her complicity in Banquo's death is a little ambiguous. But yeah, this Scorpion speech comes right before this great big party that ends up going disastrously for Macbeth and his wife. That ends in this moment of real revelation, of guilt and complicity. And what do you know? Tom's gift of the Scorpion to Shiv comes at the beginning of an episode where Tom and Shiv are holding this huge party, this huge important party that ends up going disastrously for both of them. And that leads to a real meltdown between the two of them, where a lot of their guilt and resentment and anger and mutual complicity gets aired, gets revealed. Now, Tom and Shiv do step out onto the balcony to have their little argument, but you still have this big moment of emotional collapse, just like Macbeth has. Only it's just us as the audience who gets to witness it instead of all their guests at the party. Although, to connect to the way Macbeth is becoming unhinged throughout his earlier monologue because of his deep paranoia, you have a similar parallel situation going on here where Tom becomes more and more paranoid over the course of the party as it becomes clearer and clearer to him that Shiv is betraying him, that she and Mattson are floating the idea that he could be fired. So I thought it was kind of cool how not only is there this parallel between the scorpion and what it signifies in Macbeth and what the scorpion in Succession signifies, but also this really clear parallel to where the scorpion scene appears within the larger context of both works. But on the topic of the scorpion, there is just one more thing I want to talk about, and it has nothing to do with Shakespeare, but I feel like I'd be remiss not to bring it up. And it may even be self-evident. For all I know, there could be posts all over the internet talking about this, but that's the connection between Shiv's scorpion and the famous folk tale, The Scorpion and the Frog. Now, The Scorpion and the Frog is literally a meme at this point in time, so I'm sure most of you have heard of it. But just to quickly recap the fable or the folk tale, basically a scorpion wants to get from one side of a river to another. So he approaches a frog and says, "Hey buddy, will you give me a ride across the stream?" And the frog says, "Dude, I'm not stupid. You're just going to sting me." And the scorpion says, No, I'm not going to sting you. I promise. Take me across the river. I won't sting you. It would be stupid for me to sting you. I can't swim. And the frog says, "Yeah, okay, that's logical. That makes sense. All right, I'll take you across." And then, of course, halfway to their destination, in the middle of the river, the scorpion stings the frog. And the frog, before paralysis overtakes him, says, "Buddy, why the hell did you do that? Now we're both going to drown." To which the scorpion replies, "Well, what did you expect? I'm a scorpion. I can't help myself." Of course, the moral of this fable is obvious, which is that sometimes people can't control their worst instincts, can't control who they are, even when it's very directly detrimental to them. And that sounds a lot like Shiv, doesn't it? In fact, it may even have been a little bit of foreshadowing of what happens at the end of the series, at the very climax of the finale, when Shiv just cannot help herself, when she can't bring herself to vote to kill the merger, even though she and Kendall and Roman had talked about it before and had arrived at the conclusion that this was in all of their best interests, that this was the course of action that would truly best benefit them. Now, you could argue about whether it does or doesn't, but there had been that moment of reconciliation, and they had reached that conclusion, and they had decided on a course of action. And midstream, at the critical moment, Shiv can't control herself. She can't control whether it's her resentment towards Kendall, whether it's her own ambition, whether it's just the interpersonal demons that have been lurking in their family for all this time. She can't help herself. She can't do anything but vote in a way that's going to hurt both of her brothers and possibly herself as well. And I think the connection with the scorpion and the frog may have been intentional, not only on the part of the writers, but maybe even a conscious choice being made by the Tom character. He might be making a conscious allusion to that folktale, just because, as he says, you kill me and I kill you. But, and thank you to Wikipedia for this little piece of insight, there's actually an older Persian version of this folktale, of the Scorpion and the Frog, that's actually called The Scorpion and the Turtle. And just hearing the title, I bet you can guess how it goes. So, obviously, in this version, the frog is replaced with a turtle, like, duh. But also, at the critical moment, when the scorpion goes to sting the turtle's shell protects it. And the turtle isn't hurt, isn't stung, doesn't become paralyzed, doesn't get poisoned, doesn't drown. And that kind of sounds a little bit like Tom and Shiv's relationship to me. Maybe I'm stretching here. Maybe this is a little too far. But there is a similar circumstance there where when Shiv does sting Tom, perhaps repeatedly, unlike Kendall, he doesn't drown. He survives it. He's tough and resilient enough. Or maybe he's just hard-headed enough. Maybe he just has enough heavy plating around his soft, vulnerable parts that he's able to deflect it and survive. And interestingly, apparently there's a couple of different endings to that version of the folktale. In some of them, the turtle just flips around and drowns the scorpion, just drops the scorpion in the river and says, bye, and takes off. But in other versions, the turtle is just like, dude, why? And the scorpion once again says, well, I couldn't help myself. And the turtle says, all right. And that's basically it. It's kind of brushed off. And I don't know. I kind of feel like there's an appropriateness there to that final scene between Tom and Shiv where there's no real resolution. Shiv is no less the scorpion that she was a few episodes ago. And there's no reason to believe that their relationship is going to take a dramatically different trajectory now. And yet, there's this kind of like cold acceptance that this is the way things are between them. And yeah, that's it. I belabored this point. Perhaps to death, maybe beyond death. But that's it for the video. I want to thank everyone. I really want to sincerely thank everyone who has been watching these videos. I am somehow, inexplicably, past 1,000 subscribers at this point. And I thought that if that ever happened, it would take me 6 months, it would take me a year, it would take me 2 years. It would take me a long, long time. And so I really appreciate everyone who's subscribed, everyone who's liked my videos, everyone who's commented. There's been so many unbelievably supportive comments and so many really insightful comments. So just thank you, thank you, thank you. I really appreciate it. Anyway, I've gone on way too long. Thank you again, everyone, and to hell with it. That's it.
Well, you gotta get to work.
Yeah.
No? You gotta go contribute to the great toxification.
Gotta do my part.
So I want to start this video off with the strongest spoiler alert possible. If you have not seen the Connor's Wedding episode of Succession, don't watch this video. Just turn it off. It doesn't matter. I'm not monetized. I'm not making money off this anyway. I can tell you to go away. Do not watch this video if you haven't seen that episode yet. Okay, so let's talk about Connor's Wedding, because I honestly believe it may be the greatest episode of television of the decade so far, and maybe even the greatest episode of television since Ozymandias from Breaking Bad. And I'm just going to talk extemporaneously here. This is not my forte. I haven't scripted a response to the episode. If I tried to sit down and script a real analysis of the episode, I probably wouldn't record this video for my 0 subscribers. So I just want to talk about it because this episode had a real freaking impact on me. There were moments during this episode where there were tears in my eyes, which I mean, I am not going to pretend that I have never cried at a television show or movie before that, and I'm not even going to pretend that it's a complete rarity, but for a show like Succession, which is so good at holding you at a kind of cold emotional distance from these characters, for a show that almost wants you to cultivate a kind of active disdain for the characters. For a show like that to bring you very close to tears, or maybe even to tears, over the death of a character who is, I think, through the perspective of the writers now, not necessarily through my perspective, but who is written to be a kind of abhorrent and despicable human being, right? That is an incredible accomplishment. And it's something that the writers accomplish without, I think, engaging in any kind of trickery, any kind of manipulation. Because it's very easy, I think, to get tears out of an audience, to get an emotional response out of an audience through manipulation. And you see a lot of, Grey's Anatomy type shows, let's say. these calculated tearjerkers that will use musical cues and ironic tragedy and all of these manipulative, calculated devices to get you to feel emotion. And Succession doesn't do that. In fact, Succession has spent 3 seasons and 3 episodes now placing you at an intentional emotional distance. That's not to say there haven't been emotional scenes in the series before, right? In fact, the season 3 finale contained that kind of incredible moment of reconciliation between, the 3 siblings, between Shiv and Kendall and Roman, where Kendall, finally opens up, about the fact that he killed the man. And you certainly see, aside from that scene, moments where these characters are experiencing real emotion, real despair, real agony that isn't simply played for laughs. But nonetheless, even those scenes are often exactly that, single scenes within the fabric of larger episodes. And those scenes are often bookended either by, plot points that are designed to serve as a reminder of the kind of cutthroat and ugly world that these characters inhabit, or more often than that, are simply bookended by purely comic scenes. They might be darkly comic scenes, but often by comic dialogue scenes that are supposed to make us remember that these are pretty shallow, banal people. So the show has never before attempted this kind of unbroken, perpetual motion machine of human agony and human despair. And so to do that for the first time in an episode, and to nail it the way this episode does, to nail it in a way that makes the audience feel real pathos for these characters, really feel bad for these characters, is remarkable. But let's set that aside for a moment. Let's set that aside, and let's talk about something else that this episode does that's rare in the annals of great television. If you think about great television episodes, if you think of single episodes of television shows that are widely considered to be the apex of the form, how often are those episodes climatic episodes of those series? How often are those episodes even truly representative of those series? So let me give a few examples here, right? Let's talk about the X-Files, because the X-Files in some ways, I think, was kind of the dawn of prestige TV. I know that seems weird to think about because the series had a lot of flaws. We could talk forever about the mythology episodes and its failure to deliver on some of its fundamental aspirations, but it also, I think, kind of set the template for what we consider prestige TV today, right? Serialized storytelling, a real attempt to integrate the emotional and psychological arcs of the characters into the more procedural drama, which, once again, the X-Files was not the first or only show to do that. But also, another thing the X-Files did is it gave birth, in a lot of ways, to some of these prestige series that would come after, right? Gave birth to the talent that would go on to create these shows. Vince Gilligan is the obvious example, right? Vince Gilligan cuts his teeth in the X-Files writing room and then goes on to create Better Call Saul, goes on to create Breaking Bad. So you see, I think, in the X-Files a kind of cultivation of both like the kind of template that would eventually evolve into like serialized prestige TV, and also like the cultivation of the talent that would go on to create prestige TV. So if you think about the X-Files, what's broadly considered to be one of the greatest episodes of the X-Files? Well, if you ask somebody this, you would probably get a lot of different answers to that question. But I think one of the favorite answers is Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose. And if you look at that episode and you compare it to what you would consider the archetypal episode of the X-Files, whether that's a procedural horror episode, right, like a Monster of the Week episode, or if you compare it to the other kind of archetypal X-Files episode, which is one of the mythology episodes, you know, an episode that advances the overarching conspiracy plot of the series, it really fits neither of those forms. It's not at all tied into the series' larger mythos, and it's also not really a conventional Monster of the Week story, because it's not a horror story. It's fundamentally a kind of dark existential comedy. So what's another critically acclaimed series? Well, how about The Sopranos? You're not really going to get a more archetypal prestige show than that, right? And if you ask people, what's the greatest episode of The Sopranos? Well, they're probably not going to say Made in America, even though that is the climax of the series. It's actually a deeply polarizing episode. There are a lot of people who are still, I think, fundamentally unhappy with the way the show ended. I'm not one of them. I think it's actually a great episode of television. But you're much more likely to hear Pine Barrens. Pine Barrens is another case where you're dealing with an episode that's a real departure in form from the series. It's a bottle episode, right? It's an episode about two characters, Paulie and Christopher, being out in the woods hunting this escaped hitman. It's not a complete departure from what I think you would consider to be a standard Sopranos episode, but it's very different. It's definitely a high concept episode. And while we're talking about bottle episodes, what about The Suitcase from Mad Men? That's another case where the episode that's kind of broadly considered to be the pinnacle of the series is a bottle episode, is this kind of small, constrained episode that sets aside a lot of the complex workplace dynamics and complex plot construction, right, that the series is known for, and instead very narrowly focuses on the relationship between two characters. In this case, instead of Paulie and Christopher, it's Don and Peggy. So the point I'm making here is it's very rare for the greatest episode of a television series to feel like an archetypal episode of that series. And in some cases, it's even rarer for the greatest episode of a series to be the climatic episode of that series, which isn't to say the finale, but the episode that serves as a kind of culmination of the plot up until that point. In fact, great television often totally eschews plot, or if not totally eschews plot, kind of sets this plot aside, puts it on the back burner, and fixates on the characters. There is one huge exception to this, though, and that's Ozymandias. Ozymandias is at once widely considered to be, first of all, the greatest episode of Breaking Bad, while also being a completely archetypal episode of the show, a completely typical, you could say, episode of the show in terms of the way it's structured. It's another instance where Walt gets in over his head and has to dramatically and quickly think his way out of a really perilous situation while wildly bungling that and also coming into direct conflict with his family. It's an exploration of all of the usual themes of Breaking Bad. It's an exploration of Walt's pathological pride. It's an exploration of the family dynamics that are at the heart of the series. It's an exploration of the deep fundamental conflict between Walt's desire to satiate his pride and his desire to do right by his family. And it's also a complete clusterfuck in the way that almost every episode of Breaking Bad was a clusterfuck, in the sense of it being a kind of high wire act over a trash fire. In addition to that, it's also the climax of the series. And yes, I know there are 2 episodes afterwards, Granite State and Felina. But Ozymandias is the moment that all of the plot threads of the series reach their culmination. As such, it's a real rarity that you'll have an episode that is all 3 of those things. That is the greatest episode of the series, that is a typical archetypal episode of the series, and that is also the climax of the series. And you know what? Connor's wedding is all of the above. It's the greatest episode, I think, up to this point of Succession, keeping in mind that Succession is still going. It's the greatest episode of the series because it's so emotionally effective, because it's operating at a level of writing, at a level of emotional resonance, a level of understanding of the profound psychological complexity of grief. You get to see all of these characters grieving Logan's death and responding to Logan's death, and all of these incredibly conflicted and sophisticated and, above all else, true ways. And it's funny. It's still darkly hilarious throughout. There are so many moments in that episode where there were tears in my eyes, but I was laughing. It's a powerful work of art, but it's also in every sense an archetypal, a standard, you would even say, episode of the series. Because what is it at its core? It's a series of conversations between these characters. What happens in your standard Succession episode? You see Shiv and Roman and Kendall and maybe Connor come into familiar conflict that's often set off by something their father does. And that's rooted deeply in their unbelievably conflicted and confused feelings about Logan. Their desire to simultaneously make him proud and defy him. The fact that they want revenge on him, but they also want him to love them. They want to escape the, intense gravity of his personality and his character, while also fulfilling his expectations for them, becoming the people that they think that he wants them to be. And all of those conflicts are present and accounted for in this episode. And the structure of the episode is exactly what you'd expect from an episode of Succession. There's a kind of instigating event. In this case, it's Logan simultaneously departing to go try to negotiate a new deal for the Waystar buyout, while Connor's wedding is going on, and while putting Roman in this really precarious situation where he has to decide, is he going to betray Jerry, who he obviously has real feelings for, or is he going to be loyal to his father? And if you did not know where this episode was going, you would not think that it's going to be a particularly pivotal or different episode of the series. You would think, oh, okay, this is another instance of Logan picking business over family. It's one of the more sadistic instances of this, since he simultaneously neglects one son's wedding while telling the other to fire his lover. Right? But it's still, that's a pretty standard setup for a Succession episode. And in some ways, the progression is exactly what you'd expect. It leads to a series of scenes where characters stand in a room together and argue and yell at each other and contradict each other and jockey with each other. So yeah, it's structured and plotted just like another episode of the series. It's also the climax of the series, right? And I don't think I have to belabor this point. It's the climax of the series because the single event that we have been anticipating from the pilot finally happens. Logan dies. The title of the series is fulfilled, right? The title is Succession. This is ultimately the fundamental pitch of this series is what's going to happen after Logan is gone. And finally, and I don't say finally to, criticize the series at all, because I think it's been stellar up to this point. But finally, we get the delivery on the promise of the title. Finally, we get this moment in the series where for the first time ever, the Roy kids are alone in the world. Their father isn't there anymore. And what are they going to do? So to have those three components come together in a great episode of television, to have there not be a false step anywhere along the way, is tremendous and really rare. But I want to talk about the bottle episode thing, because I said earlier, well, the suitcase is a bottle episode, which makes it a kind of non-standard episode of the series. Pine Barrens is a bottle episode, which makes it kind of a non-standard episode of the series. And by bottle episode, I don't mean it in the more traditional sense of like a cheap episode, a cheap throwaway episode, but rather just an episode that's mostly about characters being confined in a small space and having to interact with each other and having to like work through their emotions without being able to escape each other's presence. Well, shit. If you think about it, this episode is a bottle episode. It's actually a kind of dual bottle episode, because you have really just, aside from the final few scenes after the plane lands, you have really just two settings for this episode. You have the boat where Connor's wedding is occurring, and you have the plane where Logan has died and they're trying to resuscitate him while the kind of Waystar apparatchiks, the bureaucracy of Waystar Royco kind of try to simultaneously juggle the question of what do we do now that Logan is gone from a business perspective, while also trying to resolve the more concrete question of, is Logan dead? Can we save this man? And the fact that you have those two settings, and in both of those settings, the characters are trapped. You have the plane over international waters. They have to turn the plane around, bring the plane back. And on the other hand, you have the ferry where the wedding is occurring. And yes, actually, early in the episode, it would be possible for Shiv and Kendall and Robin to get off the boat. But there's a moment about midway through the episode when they realize the boat is leaving. And that becomes a major plot point. And up to that point, obviously, they've been so consumed by the shock of what's going on, they don't think to leave the boat. So this is a kind of bottle episode. But it's a bottle episode that defies the expectations of a bottle episode. Because one of the fundamental aspects of the bottle episode is that the characters can't communicate with those outside of the bottle, outside of the confined space. And that happens constantly throughout this episode. In fact, one of the central sources of drama and uncertainty in this episode is the phone calls between the characters on the plane, mostly Tom, and the characters on the boat, you know, the Roy family. And if you look at the way bottle episodes usually play out, like the X-Files, to go back to the X-Files, had some really archetypal bottle episodes. And the way those episodes were always set up, a central fact of the episode was there's no way for Mulder and Scully to contact the world outside of this Arctic base or boat or lumber camp that they're trapped in. And that inability to communicate with the outside world fuels the drama of the entire episode. And here we have a case where the lines of communication with the outside world are not broken at all. Anyone in the plane can talk to anyone on the ground or in the boat, and anyone in the boat can call anyone. But the episode does something really fascinating with that. It doesn't simply throw away the aspect of isolation and failure to communicate, or inability to communicate, that is so central to bottle episodes. Instead, it uses the nature of communication in the episode as a way to really underscore the larger themes of the series. Let me break this down for you, because this is a thought I had, and maybe it's kind of out there, maybe it's kind of weird, but think about it this way. Here's a series where people are constantly talking to each other. The vast majority of this series is dialogue, and yet intimacy, real intimate, open communication often escapes them. Real closeness often and almost inevitably escapes these characters. So what you have here, you have a situation where these characters can, once again, freely communicate with each other. At this moment, at this critical juncture of intense grief, of intense emotion, all of these characters can talk freely with each other. But they can't do the one central thing that they really desperately need and want to do at this moment, which is to be together, to be physically in the same set space, to have some real emotional intimacy with each other. There is that series of unbelievably heartbreaking moments where each of the Roy children has to say goodbye to their father over the phone, not even knowing if he's alive, not knowing if he can fucking hear them at all. And those moments, in some ways, really capture like the entire spirit of failed communication, failed real communication. That's at the heart of the series. For so many reasons, on so many levels. First of all, obviously, they would love to be in the room with Logan when he dies, because there's so much you can gain from being next to someone. Instead of being forced to try to think of adequate words to say over the phone, they could squeeze his hand. They could see if his hand is still warm, which would be meaningful in a moment like that, right? Because that tells you something real about whether he's dead or not, whether he's fully gone or not. They would be able to actually whisper these words in his ear. They would be able to actually gain a kind of catharsis and a kind of closure that's just not possible with the deep ambiguity of telling someone words over the phone knowing he might be a corpse already. There's also an even more concrete and practical consequence to the fact that these characters are in different spaces, that these characters can only communicate with each other on the phone. And that's that any chance that might have existed to save Logan's life is lost. There is absolutely nothing any of the Roy children can actually do to save Logan. And that's a function of a choice that Logan made. That's a function of the fact that he chose to get on that plane and try to save the merger rather than get on the boat and attend his son's wedding. And that's the case, obviously, because if he had the attack on the boat, not only would he have been closer to land, right? The boat is docked for the first half of the episode. Not only would it have been way easier to get him in an ambulance, but also someone would have been much more likely to notice that he had had a heart attack or a stroke earlier. Remember, in the plane, he goes in the bathroom. We don't see this on screen, but he goes in the bathroom, and it's a while before anyone realizes that something is wrong. And also, he's surrounded by sycophants who would be utterly terrified to barge into that bathroom to check on him. So you don't know how much time elapsed. Whereas on the boat, not to belabor a really practical point here, but he would have been surrounded by family and friends, and somebody, well, family and friends, and somebody probably would have picked up on what was going on earlier, and they would have been able to intercede earlier to potentially save his life. So what you have is a practical bottle, right? You have a physical bottle. You have constrained spaces that are preventing real intimacy, that are preventing real physical connection between these characters, that are preventing these characters from saving each other, from giving each other what they need, but that don't serve as actual barriers to simple rote communication. So the entire episode plays out as a series of completely hopeless conversations, completely hopeless, despairing conversations between people who can't do anything more meaningful. And man, that's incredible, because that's the entire series in one episode, perfectly encapsulated in a way that never seems simply heavy-handed and ironic, that never seems like it's winking and gesturing at the camera, in a way that really feels like you're capturing these characters in a moment of agony, in a moment where they don't know what to do, and watching them play through their emotions in real time with real psychological astuteness and truth. And yet, it's just another episode of the series, you know? And that's incredible. Is that a bug? Come on, buddy. Come on. I need you to get off of here. I don't want to crush you. Okay. Okay, so what are some other critically acclaimed series? The Sopranos. Well, there's a bug on my neck. In an unbelievable number of ways. Okay. There's a fly on me.
But I got you. I got just enough capital. I got you.
So it's been about a week since the Succession finale aired. And just first off, right off the bat, it was indeed everything I expected it to be. And more than that, it was everything I hoped it would be. I think it was just about as perfectly crafted as it could possibly have been. But I don't want to do a video that just recaps the finale, and I don't want to do a video that's just a straight-up review of the finale, because those videos have been made, and those videos have been made well. There are plenty of YouTubers out there offering their sort of broad and general takes on the Succession finale, and how, frankly, perfect it was. So instead of doing that, I want to drill down into a single scene from the finale. And I want to drill down into the scene that really affected me the most, that really, like, had the greatest, I don't know, emotional impact on me. And if somehow you clicked on this video without seeing the title or the thumbnail, you might be saying, oh, is it that oddly touching moment of reconciliation in the kitchen between the three siblings where they make Kendall his meal fit for a king and then crown him? Or is it maybe the tragic counterpoint to that scene, the final confrontation between Kendall, Shiv, and Roman, where they really tear into each other after Shiv suddenly changes her mind during the shareholders meeting? But, of course, you have read the title, you have seen the thumbnail, so you know it's not any of those scenes. And in fact, it's the very brief, maybe 1 minute final scene shared between Tom and Greg, the sticker scene. Now, I have to admit, I'm kind of a Tom stan. Like, setting aside all of my, like, attempts to look at this work objectively as a piece of art, as a piece of drama, I have just been so completely won over by the Tom character. So I've kind of been rooting for him all along. And I've long thought that the scenes shared between Tom and Greg are some of the best in the series. Like, man, if you had to make a short list of all of the best Succession scenes, there's no fucking way the water bottle scene isn't on there.
What am I doing?
So I will say that the that the fanboy or fangirl or whatever in me was secretly rooting for Tom and Greg to make up. Secretly kind of hoping that regardless of whether such a scene would be artistically or dramatically satisfying, or whether it was the best way to resolve their storylines on a more objective level, I was just rooting for a moment like this to happen, and I got it.
I got you.
But fortunately, the scene didn't end up being just a little bit of fan service for Tom and Greg aficionados out there, but actually turned out to be, I think, one of the most brilliantly crafted and truly artistically satisfying scenes, certainly in the finale, but maybe in the series writ large. So let me dig a little bit into why I think that. First of all, just to quickly recap the scene, and I'm not really sure why I'm doing this, because you shouldn't be watching this video if you haven't seen the series. But anyway, just to quickly recap the scene. Basically, Greg sort of betrayed Tom more than a little bit by letting Kendall, and by extension Shiv, know that Shiv was on the chopping block if the Madsen acquisition succeeded. And so, of course, the acquisition does succeed, and Tom ends up being the new Waystar CEO. And so after it's been announced that Tom is going to be taking the position, Greg kind of sidles up to him in in the kind of meek but calculating way that Greg acts, and starts kind of gently probing Tom, trying to suss out if Tom is angry at him, if Tom knows that he's that he betrayed him, and also, more importantly, if he has a future with the company. And Tom initially explicitly says, "You screwed me," or what he actually says is, "You fucked it," in a callback, I think, to the scene between Kendall and Roman in the previous episode.
That's because you fucked it. You fucked it, man.
and lets Greg know that Madsen has every intention of cleaning house and firing him. But then there's a reversal, and Tom says, "But I got you." And he takes one of the stickers, which you might remember from earlier in the episode, were being used by members of the Roy family and other friends, family, and employees of Logan to claim items from Logan's penthouse that they wanted to take home, that they wanted to own now that Logan is gone. The implication being basically that Tom is going to protect Greg, that Greg won't be ousted from Waystar Royco, and that their sort of contentious friendship isn't over.
I got you.
And what I really love about this scene, above and beyond the fact that it's just this oddly touching scene between these two characters that we've gotten to know pretty intimately, is that it's simultaneously very simple and also really deep and complex and ambiguous. It's sort of complex in its simplicity, as oxymoronic as it sounds. If you think about it, the power and emotional resonance of this very short, very simple 1-minute scene rests entirely in two elements. And those elements are, number one, the sticker, and number two, that very simple phrase, "I got you." And I want to dig into both quickly here. Well, hopefully quickly. Maybe slowly and pedantically, we'll see. Okay, so first, the sticker. So what is the sticker within the context of the episode? Well, first of all, and maybe most obviously, it's a means of claiming ownership. When Tom puts that sticker on Greg's forehead, on one level he's saying, "I'm claiming you. I own you. You're effectively my property now." And indeed, Tom does kind of own Greg at this moment. Not simply because he's going to be the new CEO and thus he's going to be Greg's boss and he's going to have the power to hire and fire him, but also he now has so much leverage over Greg. Personal leverage, professional leverage. Greg has maneuvered himself into such an inauspicious position that Tom really does have the power to dictate his fate. And of course, this is a series where it's not unusual for people to be treated like property, where one of the core thematic ideas is the question of where personhood ends and where property begins. And in fact, before putting the sticker on his forehead, Tom tells Greg, "I have just enough capital."
I got just enough capital.
Basically, I have just enough capital to buy you. And he's talking about social capital, of course. He's talking about his influence with Madsen. But there's that obvious direct parallel to real material financial capital. And this treating of Greg as a kind of object that has just been purchased, just been claimed. But there's another level to that sticker. There's another facet, aspect to that sticker. And it's a deeply sentimental one. You have to remember these stickers aren't just signs of ownership. They don't simply indicate the desire to claim an object as someone's property. They are indicative of a sentimental connection between the person claiming and the object being claimed. Remember, what these stickers are really saying in their original context is, this is an item that has sentimental value to me. This is an item that belonged to Logan that I have some personal, emotional connection to and that I want to own. Remember, most of the people claiming these items from Logan's penthouse are already wealthy. They're not picking out items for practical reasons or to resell them, probably. They're picking out items that meant something to them. They're picking out items that remind them of Logan and maybe remind them of the rare positive moments that they shared with Logan. Just like how the video of Logan's party that plays during that scene is that kind of rare moment of family unity, and of not just family unity, but unity between Logan and his staff, and affection between Logan and his family and his staff. So the stickers serve a kind of similar emotional purpose and carry a similar kind of emotional resonance. So when Tom puts that sticker on Greg's forehead, he's not just saying, "You're my property." He's saying, "I don't want to lose you. You're something from the old regime, from the old days of Waystar Royco that I want to hold on to, that really means something to me and I don't want to lose." In fact, he's kind of claiming Greg as his little bit of inheritance from Logan. Like, if I could take anything, if I could keep anything from my time under Logan, it would be Greg. And so that's kind of beautiful, you know, as much as like a man claiming another man as a piece of chattel can be beautiful. And there's a third and final aspect to that act of applying the sticker to Greg's forehead that I want to talk about. And that's that it's fundamentally a playful act. It's something a child would do to another child. And that's perfect because that's been the rapport between Greg and Tom all along. It's just such a perfect encapsulation of their relationship, which has always been kind of a relationship almost between an older brother and a younger brother, or between, you know, a senior and a freshman in high school. I mean, what do they call each other? The Disgusting Brothers.
The Disgusting Brothers.
So there's this kind of juvenile aspect to their relationship that can be crass, can be nasty in some ways, but also is so fundamentally youthful and playful. And just that bunk, that little bonk on the forehead, that little act is so perfect and captures the relationship so perfectly. Now, what about those words? I got you. I got you. Tom repeats those three words twice in this really short scene. And just like there's a kind of multifacetedness to the sticker, I think there's a similar kind of duality to that phrase and how it works within the episode and within the scene. So first, what's the obvious meaning of that phrase? He's saying, I've got you. I've got your back. You can depend on me. It's a statement of friendship and protection. It's a statement of loyalty, which is really odd in this show, very uncommon. And it's loyalty in spite of Greg's apparent disloyalty. So in that way, it kind of parallels the sentimental side of the sticker. But it's a statement that also has that same kind of crass materialistic side to it, just like the sticker too. Because he doesn't say, I've got your back. He doesn't say, I got your back. He says, I got you. Which could certainly also be taken to mean, I claim you. I own you. Just like the sticker can be seen as a claim of ownership over another individual. And so both of these things in this simple scene communicate simultaneously friendship and ownership. The idea that you can have a relationship between two people that is simultaneously based in real affection and real emotion, but also crassly materialistic and based in a kind of like deeply capitalist ownership. And that's so perfect, I think, because it's reflective of a theme that runs through the entire series. The question of, to what degree are these people emotional beings, and to what degree are they sort of purely functions of the market, purely materialistic, capitalistic beings? And it's kind of wonderful because this small scene in some ways parallels the great big climatic scene in the episode, which is the conflict between Shiv, Roman, and Kendall that I talked about earlier. That fight in the conference room where they just break down and just this most juvenile talking once again about this sense that like these characters are children in some way. This incredibly juvenile fight breaks out between them that escalates into name calling, that escalates into this like actual like child hissy fit fight, like basically a child slap fight between these three characters. And that scene rests upon a similar tension. The tension between what makes sense from a material and business perspective, and what a character's emotional needs and desires are driving them to do. In the case of the conflict between the Roy siblings, on the one hand, from a crassly business perspective, it makes all the sense in the world for them to cooperate, because they're going to get screwed otherwise. At this point, Shiv is fully aware that Madsen has no desire to make her CEO. So they all have more leverage, they all have more power if they work together and kill the deal. However, their emotional instincts and desires and hopes and fears and anxieties and resentments are 100% against really working together in a collaborative way. And so you see this moment where what business acumen they do have steers them towards this alliance. And then the alliance comes completely undone when their emotional childish sides come to the forefront. And you have similar forces at work in the scene between Tom and Greg, but they play out very differently. So let's look at what Tom's crass, purely materialistic business incentives are here. I mean, they're entirely to shit-can Greg and get him out of here. This isn't even the first time Greg has kind of put a knife in Tom's back or has shown like a capacity for duplicity. Not that Tom doesn't have his own capacity for duplicity.
Do you want a deal with the devil?
Remember, Greg kept the documents that Tom wanted him to destroy and then handed them over to Kendall in the season 2 finale. So not only would it be a great way for Tom to suck up to Madsen by giving Greg the boot, but it's also in Tom's own best interest because he knows on some level the day is going to come when Greg is going to screw me again. And yet Tom obviously has a deep personal affection and maybe even love, not in the romantic sense, not in the homoerotic sense, although there's like weird hints of homoeroticism in the series, I suppose.
Are you attempting to break up with me?
But like this deep, almost familiar, once again, the disgusting brothers, love for Greg. And at the end of the day, it's that affection and that maybe love that wins him over. And he makes a decision that isn't in his best business interest, but that is ultimately an emotional decision. Just like the Roy children ultimately make a series of wild emotional decisions that run contrary to their best interests. Only, instead of Tom's emotions driving him towards vindictive self-sabotage, like the Roy siblings' emotions do, his emotions drive him towards a kind of oddly selfless and affectionate act. And that's fantastic, I think, because it reveals Succession as a series that doesn't have just one bleak, angry, resentful note. It's a show that can also have moments of authentic, affectionate feeling between characters. And that's really rare for shows of this style, shows that are kind of dark and cynical and ironic a lot of the time. So yeah, it's just another example of why Succession was and is such a brilliant series. And that's it. That's all. If you're still watching, I gotta say it. It's stupid, but I gotta say it. Please like and subscribe. I think I'm at like 150 subscribers now. It's great. That might not seem like much, but hey, it's growing and it means a lot to me. So thank you to everyone who's liked, subscribed, or commented on my videos so far. I do intend to do more videos about Succession and Shakespeare, and at least a couple more videos, as I promised, about Succession and the Dream Songs. But I wanted to take a break from that just quickly and do one that is just about my appreciation for part of the series. Also, just one final note, I do want to do a few videos that aren't Succession videos, and that might be the next thing I do, just because I don't want the YouTube algorithm to decide this guy only makes Succession content, and I do want to talk about other things. Anyway, thanks so much. That's it. We're done. Bye.
You could be heading away from the endless middle and towards the bottom of the top.
The bottom of the top?
All right, that's it. Thank you. Thank you so much if you've made it through the whole video. Thank you for allowing me to just go off and ramble for probably over 2 hours now. I really appreciate your patience. I really appreciate you sticking with me. And I really appreciate you sticking with my channel all this time and watching this content, watching my content. So, that said, that's it. That's the end. I've got to say it. I've got to say it. You may have even heard this before in some of the previous videos compiled here, but please, if you have it in your heart, like, subscribe, and even better, leave a comment. What I would really like to know, actually, is what you would like me to cover in the future. I've been kind of blocked lately, honestly, and I would love it if some kind-hearted person would just go down in the comments and give me the idea for my next video. I know that's selfish. I know that's supremely selfish. But in all honesty, if you have something you would like me to talk about, whether it's about Succession or whether it's about film or literature or some other topic entirely, just say so in the comments. And if I see the comment and I have anything to say about it, I'll do my best to make that video. Anyway, thanks again. That's it. Bye. The first two videos deal with the oh my gosh, this fly. Get away, fly. Thank you to everyone who has stuck through my... Damn it, that fly. These flies are so bad.